The winter that year was one of the harshest anyone could remember in the small valley where Thomas Hale lived. Snow fell endlessly, covering the fences, the barns, and the small cabin he called home. The wind howled like a restless spirit, whipping through the bare trees and across the frozen fields. Thomas, a man in his late 40s, was accustomed to hard work and the loneliness that came with living on the edge of civilization. Yet, even he had to admit that this winter was relentless, testing his endurance and the strength of his small ranch. Thomas rose early every morning, long before the sun touched the horizon. He would check on his cattle, ensure the fences were intact, and make sure the small herd had enough feed. Each day, he wore layers of wool and leather, bracing himself against the cold that seeped into every crevice of his cabin. Life was hard, but it was familiar. It was predictable in its challenges, and Thomas had learned to face them all with patience and quiet determination. One morning, after a particularly fierce snowstorm, Thomas decided to walk the perimeter of his property. The snow had piled high in drifts, and some of the fences were nearly invisible beneath the white blanket. As he trudged through the knee-deep snow, he noticed something unusual. Near the edge of the property, where the forest met the open field, there was a faint movement, a small shadow against the white snow. At first, he thought it might be an animal, perhaps a stray coyote or a rabbit. But as he approached, he realized it was something or someone much more fragile. A woman was lying in the snow, her body shivering violently, her lips blue from the cold. Her clothing was wet and torn, barely enough to protect her from the freezing air. Thomas's heart raced. He had heard stories of people lost in the snow, sometimes never found, and he knew the danger she faced. Without a second thought, he ran to her side, kneeling in the snow, to assess her condition. The woman stirred slightly, her eyes opening just enough to meet his gaze. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair matted with snow and ice. Her eyes, though tired and filled with fear, held a quiet strength. She tried to speak, but only a weak whisper emerged. I'm frostbitten. I need to warm up." Her voice was fragile, almost swallowed by the wind. But Thomas understood immediately. She needed help, and she needed it quickly. Gently, Thomas lifted her into his arms, careful not to worsen her injuries. He wrapped her in his heavy coat, trying to shield her from the biting wind as he made his way back to the cabin. The journey was slow and exhausting, each step a struggle through the thick snow, but he did not let go of her. He talked to her softly, telling her that she was safe now, that he would take care of her. She did not respond, only closed her eyes and shivered, clinging to the warmth he offered. When they finally reached the cabin, Thomas laid her on a bed covered with thick blankets. He hurried to light the fireplace, the flames crackling to life and sending waves of warmth into the small room. The smell of burning wood filled the air, a comforting scent that seemed almost magical to the frostbitten woman. Thomas removed her wet clothing carefully, wrapping her in dry blankets, and placed hot water bottles near her feet and hands. Every movement was done with tenderness, with the understanding that she was delicate and exhausted, and that her survival depended on the care he provided. As he worked, he noticed details about her that told him more about her life. Her hands, though small and delicate, were calloused, showing she was no stranger to hard work. Her clothing, though simple and worn, had patterns that reminded him of native designs, intricate and unique. Thomas realized she was not just any lost traveler, she was likely a native woman, and perhaps alone, far from her home and family. He knew the times were dangerous. The tension between settlers and native tribes was high, and helping her could bring trouble. Yet, he could not leave her to die in the snow. His heart would not allow it. Hours passed as she lay wrapped in blankets, her body slowly regaining warmth. The color returned to her lips, and the shivering became less violent. She opened her eyes again, looking at Thomas with a mixture of fear and cautious gratitude. Her voice, still weak, managed a few words. "Thank you for helping me." Thomas nodded, understanding that her trust was fragile, and that every word she spoke required effort. In the quiet of the cabin, a fragile connection began to form. Thomas brought her simple food, warm broth and bread, and encouraged her to eat, though she could only manage small bites. He kept the fire burning, fed the stove regularly, and watched over her with the vigilance of a man who knew the thin line between life and death in the winter wilderness. Outside, the storm continued. But inside the cabin, there was a sense of safety, however temporary. As the day turned to evening, Thomas reflected on the situation. He knew that the woman could not stay hidden forever. Word could travel, neighbors might notice unusual activity, and there was always the risk of patrols searching for native people in the area. But for now, survival was the priority. He had saved her from the immediate danger, and that was enough to focus on. He would deal with the rest when the time came. Through the night, Thomas stayed awake in shifts, tending to the fire and checking her condition. The frostbite was severe in her fingers and toes, but there was hope she would recover with proper care. He whispered words of reassurance, telling her that she was safe, that the worst of the storm had passed, and that she would live. She responded with a faint nod, too weak to speak, but her eyes followed him with a quiet intensity, acknowledging the care he provided. By morning, the storm had lessened, though the world remained a frozen white expanse. The woman's condition had improved slightly. She could speak more clearly, though still softly. Thomas brought her more food and encouraged her to rest, keeping her covered in warm blankets. The bond between them, though newly formed, was growing in a way that did not require many words. Acts of kindness, shared warmth, and simple gestures communicated more than speech ever could. Thomas began to understand her story, even if only in fragments. She was alone, separated from her people, and struggling to survive in a world that was often hostile to her kind. The strength she had shown in reaching him, walking through the snow, and surviving the storm, impressed him deeply. She was not a helpless figure. She was resilient, brave, and deserving of every effort he could provide to help her recover. The winter continued, relentless and unforgiving. But in that small cabin, a sense of hope began to emerge. Two lives, strangers to each other in a vast and dangerous land, had intersected in a moment of crisis. Through compassion, courage, and simple humanity, Thomas had saved a life, and in doing so, had begun a story that neither of them would ever forget. As the sun rose higher in the sky, glinting off the snow outside, Thomas looked at the woman and smiled gently. She returned the gesture with a faint, grateful nod. Neither spoke much, but both understood that they had crossed a threshold together, one from despair to survival, one from fear to trust. The first day of her recovery had begun, and with it, the story of their unexpected connection in a frozen, unforgiving world. The morning after Thomas Hale had brought the young Apache woman into his cabin, the world outside remained a frozen wasteland. Snow still lay thick on the ground, and icy winds swept across the barren fields, rattling the wooden shutters of his small home. Inside, however, the cabin was warm, lit by the dancing flames in the fireplace, and filled with the faint smell of burning wood and simple food. The woman, now partially recovered from the frostbite, lay wrapped in thick blankets, her dark eyes observing Thomas as he moved about the room. Thomas had spent the night quietly tending to her. He had brought hot water to her hands and feet, carefully massaging them to restore circulation, and had even made small attempts to warm her chest and shoulders without alarming her. Every movement was slow and deliberate, guided by caution and a deep concern for her fragile state. He realized that her survival depended not only on warmth but also on calm, steady care. Panic, cold, or sudden movement could worsen her injuries. She stirred, slowly opening her eyes. Her lips were no longer a deep blue, but her hands were still pale and swollen. "The fire. It helps," she whispered, her voice hoarse but growing stronger. Thomas nodded, offering her a warm cup of broth. She accepted it with trembling hands, sipping cautiously. He watched her carefully, noting every reaction, every shiver, every slight wince. He could see that she had endured far more than he could imagine, Yet she was still alive, still determined to survive. Thomas felt a growing sense of responsibility. He knew that she was not just a lost traveler. She was a young woman, alone, in a hostile world. The Apache people, like many native tribes, had suffered greatly during the ongoing conflicts and forced relocations. And Thomas realized she might have been separated from her family or her community. She had endured the snowstorm, frostbite, hunger, and fear. And now, she was in his care. That thought weighed heavily on him. He could not turn away. Throughout the morning, he continued to care for her. He brought her dry clothes, his own spare garments that had been kept for emergencies, and helped her into them gently. Each movement was accompanied by soft reassurances, words meant to comfort rather than instruct. She nodded slightly, her trust growing in small increments. Thomas understood that this trust was fragile. Any misstep could frighten her or make her withdraw. He moved with patience and quiet determination, aware that he was not only tending to her physical needs but also nurturing the fragile beginnings of hope. As she regained warmth, the woman began to speak in small fragments. Her English was limited, but enough to convey basic information. She told him her name, Nayeli, which Thomas repeated carefully, committing it to memory. She shared brief details of her journey, explaining that she had been separated from her tribe during a forced relocation and had become lost in the snow. Each word she spoke was an effort, and Thomas listened attentively, offering gentle nods and soft encouragement. Despite the language barrier, a bond was forming between them. Nayeli, who had spent the past days facing unimaginable danger alone, began to rely on Thomas not just for warmth and safety, but for the comfort of companionship. Thomas, a man accustomed to solitude, found himself feeling a protective responsibility toward her. Their lives had intersected in a moment of crisis, and now they were connected by survival, trust, and mutual respect. The day passed slowly. Thomas moved around the cabin, feeding the fire, preparing simple meals, and tending to the small household tasks that kept life going. Nayeli watched quietly, occasionally helping where she could, though her strength was limited. Her eyes followed him with curiosity, and sometimes with silent questions. Thomas responded with gentle guidance, showing her how to lift a pot, how to stir the fire, how to handle the simplest of chores. Each interaction, though small, strengthened the bond between them. By late afternoon, Thomas noticed that her frostbite had begun to improve, though her fingers and toes were still swollen and tender. He knew the recovery would be slow, and that patience was essential. He encouraged her to move her fingers and toes gently, to eat and drink steadily, and to rest as much as possible. Nayeli followed his instructions with quiet determination, understanding that her survival depended on her cooperation and strength. As evening approached, Thomas brought out a small blanket and placed it over Nayeli's shoulders. She shivered slightly, but the warmth of the cabin and the fire seemed to reach her slowly. He sat beside her, talking quietly about small things, about the weather, about the cattle, about the routines of life on the ranch. Nayeli listened intently, her eyes reflecting both curiosity and cautious trust. Though she spoke little, her presence was comforting, and Thomas found himself appreciating the quiet companionship that had grown between them. That night, Thomas made preparations to ensure Nayeli's continued safety and comfort. He arranged extra blankets near her bed, filled a basin with warm water for washing, and kept a pot of broth on the stove. He realized that the snowstorm outside was not yet over, and that venturing out would be dangerous. They were trapped together by circumstance, and yet, the situation created a rare opportunity for connection and understanding. During the night, Nayeli woke several times, shivering and whispering softly. Thomas responded immediately, bringing the fire closer, placing warm water bottles near her, and holding her hand until she relaxed. He could feel the tension in her small body, the lingering fear from the journey she had endured. He spoke softly, reassuring her that she was safe, that she was no longer alone, and that help and warmth were now within reach. Each word seemed to calm her, though her eyes still reflected the shadow of the trauma she had faced. In the days that followed, Thomas and Nayeli began to establish a routine. She gradually regained strength, eating small meals, resting more comfortably, and moving around the cabin with greater ease. Thomas continued to tend to her injuries, cleaning frostbitten areas and applying salves he had learned to make from natural remedies. Though the recovery was slow, progress was visible, and both of them felt a quiet satisfaction in each small victory. As Nayeli's strength returned, she began to reveal more about her life. She spoke of her family, of her tribe, and of the customs and traditions that had shaped her upbringing. Though her English was limited, Thomas listened carefully, asking gentle questions and offering encouragement. He learned about the struggles her people had faced, the forced relocations, and the dangers that still surrounded them. Her stories, though brief, painted a vivid picture of resilience, courage, and the human spirit. Thomas realized that he had become more than just a caretaker. He had become a protector, a witness to Nayeli's survival, and a participant in a story that was larger than either of them. He understood the risks of sheltering her, but he also recognized the moral imperative to help a fellow human being in need. The world outside could be harsh and unforgiving, but inside the small cabin, kindness, empathy, and trust were the guiding forces. By the end of the week, Nayeli was strong enough to sit by the fire without shivering uncontrollably, to eat full meals, and to move about the cabin with confidence. She and Thomas had established a quiet rhythm, a partnership born of necessity but strengthened by mutual respect. Each day brought new opportunities for connection, and both of them began to anticipate the simple joys of shared meals, warm fires, and conversation, even if limited by language. Thomas knew that the moment of truth would eventually come. Nayeli could not remain hidden forever. Patrols and neighbors might notice her presence, and the outside world was unforgiving to a young Apache woman alone. Yet, for now, the priority was survival. Thomas had learned that sometimes, the greatest acts of courage were quiet, unseen, and performed not for recognition but for the simple fact that they were right. As night fell once more, Thomas watched Nayeli as she slept peacefully, wrapped in warmth and safety. The snowstorm had passed for the moment, and the world outside was calm, though cold. Inside, however, there was a sense of hope, a fragile yet growing assurance that she would survive, that trust could be built, and that the bond between two strangers could endure even in the harshest of circumstances. For Thomas, the experience had already changed him. He had faced countless challenges in his life on the ranch, but nothing had tested his compassion and patience like caring for Nayeli. And for Nayeli, the cabin, the fire, and Thomas's steady presence represented something more than survival. They represented safety, trust, and a glimpse of a world where kindness still existed. In the quiet hours of the night, as the wind whispered against the cabin walls, both of them understood something unspoken. Life was fragile, but connection was powerful. The encounter that had begun with desperation and frostbite was slowly evolving into a story of trust, courage, and quiet resilience. And though the challenges of the world outside were far from over, inside that small cabin, warmth, hope, and humanity were prevailing against the cold. Days passed in the small cabin, and with each day, Nayeli grew stronger. The frostbite in her fingers and toes had begun to heal, and she could move more freely around the room. The warmth of the fire, the steady care of Thomas, and the quiet rhythm of the cabin had allowed her body to recover. But it was not only her physical strength that was returning. Nayeli's spirit, which had been weighed down by fear, isolation, and loss, was slowly lifting as well. Thomas had grown used to her presence, and he found that he had begun to notice her in ways he had never expected. She had a quiet dignity, even in her weakened state, and a calm resilience that fascinated him. She was careful in her movements, deliberate in her actions, and always observant of her surroundings. He could see that her life had been shaped by hardship, by survival, and by lessons that went beyond what he had ever known. In spite of everything, she had endured, and that endurance inspired him. The cabin, once filled only with the sounds of creaking wood and crackling fire, began to feel alive with their shared presence. They spoke when necessary, though their conversations were limited. Thomas spoke slowly, clearly, and patiently, and Nayeli responded with the few English words she knew, supplemented by gestures and expressions. Though their language was not perfect, their understanding of each other grew with every day, proving that connection did not require fluency, only patience, empathy, and shared experience. One afternoon, while Thomas was repairing a section of the fence near the cabin, Nayeli gathered the courage to ask him a question. Her voice was soft, but steady, and it carried a hint of curiosity. You help me. Why?" she asked, her dark eyes searching his face for an answer. Thomas paused, leaning on his hammer, and considered her question carefully. I do what is right," he said slowly. "You were in danger. No one should be left to die in the snow." He looked at her earnestly, hoping she would understand. Nayeli nodded, and for a moment, the weight of silence passed between them, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. The simplicity of his answer seemed to satisfy her. She had expected judgment, suspicion, or even anger. But instead, she found kindness and understanding a rare gift in the world she had come from. As the days wore on, Thomas and Nayeli began to establish small routines that helped both of them feel secure. She helped him with the fire, gathering small pieces of wood and learning how to carefully add them to the flames. He taught her how to prepare simple meals, stirring the pot over the stove, breaking bread, and pouring warm broth. Even these small tasks became a source of connection, a way for them to communicate without words, and a way for Nayeli to regain her sense of agency after days of helplessness. Through these routines, Thomas also learned more about her life. Nayeli shared fragments of her story, speaking of her family and tribe, and of the forced relocations that had scattered her people. She spoke of the land she loved, the mountains and rivers that had been home, and the customs that guided her community. Though her English was limited, Thomas listened carefully, piecing together the narrative from her words, gestures, and the emotions in her voice. Each story painted a vivid picture of a life disrupted by violence and displacement, yet filled with resilience, courage, and beauty. Despite the warmth of the cabin and the growing bond between them, Thomas knew that danger still existed outside. Patrols were known to travel through the area, searching for native people who had escaped or survived forced relocations. Word could travel quickly, and the small community nearby was suspicious of strangers. Thomas had to remain vigilant, not only to protect Nayeli, but also to ensure that his own livelihood and safety were not compromised. Each creak of the floorboards, each distant sound in the wind, reminded him that their safety was temporary and fragile. One evening, as a storm approached, Thomas and Nayeli sat near the fire, sharing the quiet companionship that had grown between them. Nayeli, now able to speak more clearly, told him about the journey that had brought her to the cabin. She spoke of the snow-covered trails she had followed, the nights spent shivering under trees, and the hunger that gnawed at her during those long hours. Thomas listened in silence, heart heavy with empathy, recognizing the incredible courage it had taken for her to survive. Their conversations slowly shifted from survival to hope. Nayeli began to ask questions about Thomas's life, about the ranch, the animals, and his days spent in the snow and cold. She seemed fascinated by the rhythm of his work, the careful tending of the land, and the way he found meaning in tasks that others might consider simple or mundane. In turn, Thomas learned about her perspectives, her values, and the deep respect she had for nature and community. Their bond was no longer just about survival, it was about understanding, learning, and sharing moments of humanity amidst a harsh world. As winter wore on, Thomas noticed subtle changes in Nayeli. She began to smile more frequently, a small but significant sign that her spirit was healing. She laughed softly when Thomas made a joke, or when the cat, a small stray he had taken in, played clumsily near the fire. Her curiosity returned as well. She asked about plants, animals, and objects in the cabin, touching and examining things with wonder. Each moment of joy, each small discovery, reinforced the idea that she was regaining not only her strength, but also her sense of life beyond survival. Yet, despite the warmth of the cabin and the growing trust between them, Thomas knew that the outside world remained perilous. Patrols could appear at any moment, and the local settlers might question the presence of a young Apache woman on his property. He could not shield her forever, and the realization weighed heavily on him. The bond they had formed was precious, but it existed in a delicate balance between trust, survival, and the dangers that lurked just beyond the cabin walls. One morning, as the sun filtered weakly through the snow-laden trees, Thomas and Nayeli ventured briefly outside. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the cold air bit at their faces. But Nayeli walked steadily, guided by Thomas. He showed her how to move carefully over the icy ground, how to avoid hidden hazards, and how to watch for signs of approaching travelers. She listened attentively, her eyes wide with focus and determination. It was a lesson in survival, but also in trust. They relied on each other completely, learning to read gestures, expressions, and subtle cues without the need for many words. Inside the cabin that evening, they shared a quiet meal. The fire crackled warmly, and the shadows danced on the walls, painting the room with a sense of safety and intimacy. Nayeli began to speak more openly about her fears, the fear of being found, the fear of never seeing her people again, and the fear of dying alone in the snow. Thomas listened with patience, offering reassurance without judgment. He could not promise safety from all threats, but he could promise that she was not alone, and that promise, however small, meant more to her than words could express. Over time, Thomas realized that their bond was no longer merely practical. They had come to rely on each other emotionally as well as physically. Nayeli's presence filled a loneliness he had long carried, and his protection and care gave her a sense of hope she had not felt in months. Each day reinforced their connection, a silent understanding that in a world filled with uncertainty and danger, they had found trust, companionship, and the quiet strength to endure together. Though the winter was far from over, both Thomas and Nayeli had found a rhythm of life within the cabin. They worked, ate, laughed, and spoke together, creating a small sanctuary against the harshness of the world outside. Each day was a test of patience, resilience, and understanding. Yet each day also brought moments of quiet triumph, a warm meal, a shared smile, a safe night of rest. These moments, simple as they were, became the foundation of their growing bond, a bond that would carry them through the trials yet to come. By the end of this period, Thomas had begun to realize something profound. He had saved Nayeli from immediate danger, yes, but in doing so, he had also discovered the depths of human connection. Compassion, patience, and trust could transcend language, culture, and fear. In the small, frozen cabin, amidst the harsh winds and snow outside, two strangers had found a way to survive together, and in the process, had begun to change each other's lives forever. The days that followed the thawing of the storm brought with them a new sense of urgency. Thomas Hale had grown accustomed to the quiet companionship of Nayeli, and he cherished the routine they had established. Yet he could no longer ignore the dangers that lurked beyond the walls of his cabin. Word of an Apache woman in the area could reach patrols or neighbors at any time, and the consequences could be severe. The thought weighed heavily on him, but he knew that protecting her in secrecy was only a temporary solution. Nayeli, for her part, sensed the growing tension. She had regained her strength and could move with confidence, but the anxiety of being discovered had never fully left her. She asked questions quietly, her voice hesitant, about what might happen if strangers came to the cabin. Thomas tried to reassure her, explaining in simple words that they must be careful, that he would protect her as best as he could, but that there might come a time when they would have to move. Her eyes reflected both understanding and worry, and he realized that the decision they faced was not only about survival but about trust and courage. One morning, Thomas noticed tracks in the snow near the edge of his property. They were faint, but they were unmistakably human. His heart pounded as he examined them. They could belong to neighbors, traveling settlers, or patrols searching the surrounding area. He quickly signaled to Nayeli to remain inside the cabin, keeping low and hidden from view. The wind carried voices faintly across the snow, and he realized that their time in the cabin without risk was coming to an end. The safety they had known for weeks was no longer guaranteed. That evening, Thomas spoke to Nayeli with urgency. He explained that the outside world was dangerous, that they could not stay in the cabin forever, and that they would need a plan to reach safety. Her eyes widened with concern, but she nodded slowly, understanding that they had no choice. Though her English was limited, she trusted him. He would not lead her into danger. He had already saved her once, and she knew that he would do so again if he could. Thomas began preparing for their journey. He gathered supplies, dried meat, bread, water, and small blankets, and packed them carefully into a sturdy satchel. He instructed Nayeli on how to carry herself in the snow, how to move quietly, and how to recognize hazards along the trail. She listened intently, absorbing each instruction with determination. The lessons were not easy, but both of them understood the stakes. This was no longer a simple matter of survival within the safety of the cabin. Their journey into the wilderness would test both their endurance and their courage. The following day, when the snow was firm enough to walk without sinking too deeply, they set out together. Thomas led the way, choosing paths that were less likely to be observed from a distance, using the cover of trees and terrain to shield them from view. Nayeli followed closely, moving with careful precision. Each step was deliberate, each movement measured. The cold air bit at their faces, but they pressed on, driven by the need to reach a place where she could be safe from those who would do her harm. As they traveled, Thomas and Nayeli faced the harsh realities of the winter wilderness. The snow was deep in some areas, making each step a struggle. Hidden ice patches threatened to send them sliding, and frozen streams required careful navigation. Hunger and fatigue gnawed at their bodies, but neither of them allowed despair to take hold. Thomas encouraged Nayeli when her strength wavered, offering warm sips of water from his flask and reminding her to conserve energy. In turn, she provided quiet courage, moving steadily beside him despite her lingering fear. Along the way, Thomas noticed the signs of wildlife tracks in the snow, birds overhead, and the distant howl of wolves. He taught Nayeli to watch for these indicators, to understand which signs meant danger and which meant safety. They collected small branches for firewood at night and learned to make temporary shelters to rest and regain warmth. The wilderness was unforgiving, but it also offered moments of awe and beauty. The glitter of snow and sunlight, the quiet stillness of the forest, and the subtle sounds of life, hidden beneath the frost. One night, as they rested in a small natural shelter made from fallen branches and snow, Nayeli spoke quietly about her hopes. She longed to see her people again, to return to the mountains and rivers that had been her home. She spoke of her family, of faces she remembered from childhood, and of the traditions she had been forced to leave behind. Thomas listened, silent and respectful, understanding that their journey was not only physical but emotional. Nayeli's survival depended on reaching safety, but her heart depended on reclaiming a sense of belonging and identity. The days of travel were grueling. Snowstorms returned intermittently, slowing their progress and forcing them to seek shelter repeatedly. Their supplies dwindled, and the cold remained relentless. Thomas and Nayeli grew closer through these hardships, relying on each other completely. Their conversations became more open, and the trust between them deepened. Thomas shared stories of his own past, of life on the ranch, and of the long winters he had endured. Nayeli listened intently, offering small smiles and nods of understanding. In the harsh wilderness, they had become companions, allies, and, in some ways, a family of two. As they neared the outskirts of a forested area where Nayeli believed her people might be, or where she could find safety, Thomas's concern grew. Patrols and settlers were known to travel near these areas, and any encounter could be dangerous. He instructed Nayeli to move quietly, to avoid leaving obvious tracks, and to stay close to him. Every step required caution, and every rustle in the trees or distant shout set their nerves on edge. Yet they pressed on, driven by necessity, and by the hope that freedom and safety were within reach. One evening, they reached a small clearing with a frozen stream running through it. Thomas and Nayeli paused to rest, sitting on a fallen log as the fire from earlier embers glowed faintly beneath the snow. Nayeli's face, illuminated by the fading light, showed both exhaustion and determination. She turned to Thomas and whispered, "Thank you. You helped me. More than life." Thomas nodded quietly, moved by the sincerity of her words. He understood that the journey had bonded them in ways neither could have anticipated, and that their shared struggle had created a connection stronger than words could convey. The final leg of their journey was the most dangerous. Open fields lay ahead, exposing them to the risk of being seen by travelers or patrols. Thomas chose to travel at dawn, when the snow reflected light but visibility from a distance was still limited. Nayeli moved with careful attention, following his lead, and they advanced slowly but steadily. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke from nearby cabins, reminding Thomas that they were close to human settlements, but also that discovery could happen at any moment. Finally, as the sun rose higher in the sky, they reached the edge of the forest where Nayeli believed her people or a safe settlement might be. Relief washed over both of them, though tempered by the knowledge that the journey was not yet complete. Thomas took a moment to ensure that she was rested, that their supplies were sufficient for the final steps, and that she understood the importance of moving carefully. Nayeli nodded, her eyes reflecting gratitude, exhaustion, and hope all at once. Thomas knew that this moment, standing at the threshold of potential safety, was bittersweet. He had guided her through storms, snow, and danger. Yet he understood that their paths might soon diverge. Nayeli's journey to safety was her own, and he would have to let her go, even though he had grown deeply attached to her. Their shared experiences had created a bond that neither could forget, but the next steps required courage, independence, and faith. As they prepared to leave the forest and approach the hidden paths leading to safety, Thomas offered her final words of guidance. "Move carefully, trust yourself, and you will be safe," he said softly. Nayeli nodded, understanding the weight of his words. With a final look of gratitude and trust, she stepped forward, following the path that would lead her away from danger and toward the hope of reunion with her people. Thomas watched her disappear among the trees, feeling a mixture of relief, pride, and quiet sorrow. He knew that he had done everything he could to ensure her survival, and yet, he also knew that the bond they had formed would remain with him forever. The journey had tested both their courage and their humanity, and in the end, it had proven that compassion, trust, and determination could overcome even the harshest challenges. The morning air was crisp and quiet as Nayeli stepped cautiously along the narrow path that led through the forest. The heavy snow that had blanketed the land for weeks had softened slightly, but the ground was still cold and unforgiving. Each step she took carried the weight of months of fear, struggle, and survival. Her body was stronger now, the frostbite in her hands and feet nearly healed. But her spirit carried the memories of hardship. Yet, she moved forward with determination, fueled by the hope of reaching safety and, perhaps, reconnecting with her people. Thomas watched from a distance, hidden behind a thick stand of trees, his heart a mix of relief and unease. He had guided her this far, and she had survived every challenge the wilderness had thrown at them. Now, he knew, she would have to continue on her own. The bond they had formed during these weeks was strong, forged in moments of crisis, shared warmth, and mutual trust. But the world outside the forest was vast, unpredictable, and fraught with danger, and he had to let her go. As Nayeli moved ahead, Thomas called out softly, offering final guidance. "Remember what I taught you. Move carefully, watch the tracks, and trust yourself." Nayeli turned, giving him a small, grateful smile. Her dark eyes held a depth of emotion he could not put into words: gratitude, respect, and perhaps even a hint of sadness at leaving the man who had saved her life. She nodded, acknowledging his words, and then turned back to the path that would lead her to freedom. The forest gradually opened into a wide, snow-covered valley. Here, the trees thinned, and the wind carried the faint sounds of life, distant voices, the murmur of a stream, and the occasional movement of animals. Nayeli moved cautiously, recalling Thomas's instructions. She stayed close to the cover of the remaining trees, careful not to leave obvious tracks that might reveal her presence to anyone who might be searching. Her senses were sharp. Every sound, every movement, every shadow was a clue she could not ignore. Hours passed, and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Nayeli's legs ached. Her hands were cold despite gloves, and fatigue threatened to slow her pace, yet she pressed on, reminding herself of the stakes. Every step brought her closer to safety, closer to a life beyond fear, beyond hiding, and beyond the isolation she had endured. She thought of her family, of the mountains and rivers she had once called home, and of the people she hoped to see again. Those thoughts fueled her determination, giving her strength she did not realize she still possessed. Meanwhile, Thomas returned to the cabin, the quiet stillness settling around him. The fire burned low in the stove, and the remnants of their hurried preparations for the journey lay scattered across the table. He felt a profound mix of emotions: relief that Nayeli had survived the journey thus far, pride in her courage and resilience, and a quiet sadness at the thought of her leaving. He knew that she would be safe if she followed the path, but the bond they had formed in the small cabin and the wilderness was undeniable. As night approached, Nayeli found a small, hidden grove where she could rest safely. She built a modest fire using twigs and branches, careful to keep it low so as not to attract unwanted attention. Sitting close to the warmth, she reflected on the journey she had endured: the storm, the cold, the hunger, and the relentless snow. She remembered the kindness Thomas had shown her, how he had saved her from frostbite and near death, and how he had taught her the skills necessary to survive in the harsh wilderness. Gratitude filled her heart, and a sense of hope blossomed alongside it. The next morning, she resumed her journey, moving with renewed determination. She kept to the hidden paths, avoiding open areas, and using the natural cover of the landscape to shield herself from view. As she walked, she recalled the lessons Thomas had taught her: the importance of observing tracks, listening to the wind, and reading the signs of wildlife. Every detail he had shared was now a tool for survival, and she used them all with careful attention. Her confidence grew with each step. The fear that had once dominated her thoughts slowly giving way to self-reliance. By midday, Nayeli reached the outskirts of a small, sheltered settlement. It was a quiet place, hidden from the main roads, where other native families and individuals seeking refuge had gathered. The sight of other people, the presence of life and community, brought a wave of emotion she could hardly contain. Relief, hope, and joy mixed together. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that she would survive and perhaps reconnect with those she had lost. She approached cautiously, mindful of the new people around her, yet eager to find a place among them. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his daily routine on the ranch, but his thoughts often drifted to Nayeli. He wondered about her journey, whether she had reached safety, and how she was faring among her people. Though he never expressed it aloud, he felt a sense of fulfillment in knowing that he had made a difference in her life. The memory of her trust, her gratitude, and the quiet moments they had shared during recovery and travel would remain with him forever. When Nayeli finally met members of her community, she shared her story in fragments, describing the man who had saved her and the journey they had undertaken together. The people listened with awe and gratitude, marveling at her resilience and at Thomas's courage. Though he had remained distant from them, they recognized the debt of kindness owed to the man who had risked his own safety to protect a stranger. Nayeli's story became a testament to the strength of compassion and the power of human connection, even in the harshest circumstances. As winter finally began to loosen its grip on the land, Nayeli settled into her new surroundings. The community she had joined offered safety, warmth, and companionship, and she began to rebuild the life that had been interrupted by fear and displacement. Yet, she never forgot Thomas, the man who had given her a second chance at life. His lessons, his guidance, and his quiet courage remained a part of her, shaping her understanding of trust, kindness, and resilience. Back at the ranch, Thomas reflected on the events of the past weeks. The cabin, the snow, and the long days of care for Nayeli had left a lasting mark on him. He realized that heroism was not always grand or public. Sometimes it was quiet, unseen, and performed out of simple moral duty. Saving a life, teaching someone to survive, and showing compassion without expectation of reward, these were acts of courage that defined the true measure of a person. In the quiet of the evening, Thomas would sometimes walk to the edge of the property, gazing toward the forest where Nayeli had vanished. He imagined her walking through the trees, moving steadily towards safety, her spirit unbroken by the hardships she had faced. He smiled softly to himself, filled with both pride and a touch of longing. Their paths had crossed in a time of crisis, and though they were now separated, the bond they had formed remained unbroken in memory and spirit. The story of Thomas and Nayeli spread quietly among the nearby settlers and the native communities alike. It became a tale of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of human compassion. People spoke of the man who had saved a young woman from the snow, and the woman who had survived against all odds through determination, trust, and careful guidance. Their journey became more than a story of survival. It became a lesson in humanity, empathy, and the quiet heroism that exists in acts of kindness. For Nayeli, life gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. She worked alongside others in the community, learned new skills, and shared stories of her journey to inspire those around her. The memory of Thomas remained vivid in her mind, a symbol of hope and courage. She carried with her the lessons of survival, the importance of trust, and the knowledge that even in the darkest times, there are people willing to act with compassion and bravery. Thomas, too, continued his life on the ranch, forever changed by the experience. He tended to his cattle, repaired fences, and maintained the routines that defined his daily life, yet he did so with a deeper understanding of human connection. He had learned that helping another person, even a stranger, could create a bond that transcended language, culture, and circumstance. The memory of Nayeli's trust, resilience, and quiet gratitude remained a source of strength and reflection for him. Though they were separated by distance and circumstance, the story of their meeting, the winter, the cabin, the journey through snow, and the eventual safe arrival of Nayeli remained a testament to courage and compassion. Two lives, once strangers, had intersected in a moment of crisis and changed each other forever. Their story was one of survival, trust, and the enduring power of kindness in a world that could often be harsh and unforgiving. In the end, both Thomas and Nayeli understood that the most meaningful connections in life are often forged in the most difficult of circumstances. The winter that had brought danger and uncertainty had also brought opportunity. The opportunity to save a life, to learn from another, and to witness the strength of the human spirit. And as the snow slowly melted and the land began to awaken with the promise of spring, both of them carried forward the lessons, memories, and gratitude that would stay with them for the rest of their lives.